Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 520, and today is December 29th, 2023. This will be the last episode of the year. I did get a couple questions on the year-end in review podcast, so I do plan on doing that at some point next week. If anybody else has questions, looking back on 2023, looking ahead on 2024, send myself or Connor Freeman, the co-host of the show, some kind of question, and we will try to address it on the show next week. So far, the questions have been great, and so we will definitely do that. Also, a reminder, it is the end of the year fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We only do fundraisers twice a year at the Institute, and the money goes to paying staff, and everybody at the Institute is constantly working to produce the most important and up-to-date libertarian content. I mainly focus on the foreign policy issue. I put out the daily news roundup, this show, Conflicts of Interest, as well as news stories every day at the Institute. We also have great op-eds and are constantly publishing books all the time. This year we published books by Keith Knight, Tom Woods, Lori Calhoun, Joseph Solis Mullins, and James Bovard. And next year, my audience in particular, I'm sure, is very excited to get their hands on Scott Horton's book, Provoked, on the war in Ukraine. So if you'd like to help us continue to do what we do, head on over to the Institute and make a donation today while we still have matching funds. And if you can't make a donation or you've already made a donation, completely understand. Just think about either sharing this show or sharing a link to the Institute fundraiser and, asking other people to make a contribution and help us to reach our goal. We are almost there. All right, let's get into the news today. First up here, Venezuela responds to UK warship deployment to Guyana by conducting war games. So we mentioned this on the last show that we had what seemed to be a diplomatic path set up for Venezuela and Guyana to resolve their issue over disputed territory. And then the UK elected to deploy a warship to Guyana, and this really seems to have upset the Venezuelan government. So the AP reports President Nicolas Maduro ordered the Venezuelan armed forces to conduct defensive exercises in the Eastern Caribbean after the United Kingdom sent a warship to Guyana's territorial waters as the South American neighbors dispute a large border region. And of course, the worst part about this is Maduro had met with the Guyana leader, and the two countries agreed to settle their territorial dispute through diplomacy. However, the deployment of a UK warship seems to have interrupted the diplomatic path. All right, now moving on to some news about the war in Ukraine. U.S. announces $250 million arms package for Ukraine. The Biden administration announced a new $250 million package for Ukraine that the White House said will be the last until Congress approves a new spending for the proxy war. This surprised me a little bit that this really is the last one and that it's so small. I had thought that the White House would have tried to use all the billions it has in PDA funds for Ukraine. But my guess is that this, really indicates that the accounting error that the Pentagon came up with over the summer really wasn't an accounting error and was just a budgetary trick that the White House tried to do. And so what's happened is the White House does have additional funds it claims it has available to send weapons to Ukraine, but the funds that the White House has to send weapons to Ukraine are really funds meant to replenish the U.S. stockpiles after the U.S. sends arms to Ukraine. And that's where the shortage is. The U.S. can't send more arms to Ukraine because we can't replenish the U.S. stockpiles because they don't have weapons funding for that at this point. And so this is interesting. I also thought the NDAA included a small amount, about $300 million in arms for Ukraine. And so it'll be interesting if maybe next year the White House tries to use that money before Congress passes the bill. The Republicans say they are drawing a hard line on the border issue, and they're going to make Biden acquiesce to their demands on immigration in order to get anything passed on the Ukraine issue. So just a quick rundown of the $250 $450 million package, additional munitions for National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, air defense system components, additional ammunition for HIMARS, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, tow missiles, Javelin, and AT-4 anti-armor systems, more than 15 million rounds of small arms and ammunition, demolition munitions for obstacle clearing, spare parts, medical equipment, maintenance, and other ancillary equipment. One thing I wonder about the demolitions munitions. In the past, the White House has sent those to Ukraine when they were using them to conduct offensive operations to blow apart barricades, to clear maybe minefields or something like that. But the Ukrainians are being pretty open that they are going to have to move into defensive positions and won't be conducting offensive operations. Another thing that's been going on in Ukraine is that they've really been ramping up kind of a makeshift drone program where they're putting explosives on small drones. And I think these are like a lot of drones that you could say buy online. These aren't, you know, military drones by any means, but just drones in general, racing drones and things like that. And they've been strapping explosives onto that. And so I wonder if maybe they could repurpose these explosives for their drone program. All right, next up here, Ukraine beginning to lose gains made during costly counteroffensive. The New York Times reports Russia has recaptured land hard won by Ukrainian troops at the peak of their summer counteroffensive in the south. The situation has reinforced the war's latest reality. With their counteroffensive stalled, Ukrainian troops are now on their back foot in many places. The deputy director of the Ukrainian Parliament's Committee on National Security, Defense, and Intelligence said, "Now we are losing some fields. But if the U.S. aid is delayed, we will begin to lose towns. Without American ammunition, we will begin to lose territory that has all hard won this summer." And you know, one of the worst things about this, of course, is that the counteroffensive was extremely unsuccessful and racked up a huge number of casualties for the Ukrainian soldiers. I think really started to shit the morale among the Ukrainian people, seeing the war as more of a fool's errand, that, you know, they're losing their countrymen for little, if any, gains whatsoever. And so for them to be losing this territory is probably going to really add to that morale blow. Next up is a really important article here by Dave DeCamp. Report U.S.'s shifting strategy on Ukraine. The U.S. and its European allies are quietly shifting their strategy in Ukraine from supporting Kiev's unrealistic goal of driving Russian forces out to encourage a defensive posture with future negotiations in mind. This was a report from Politico, and it cited U.S. and European officials. The U.S. and its close allies have discouraged peace talks throughout the conflict, including in March and April of 2022, when a peace deal is on the table that would have left Ukraine's territorial integrity intact in exchange for the country's neutrality, something that was recently confirmed by Ukraine's leading negotiator at the talks. Instead of pushing for peace, then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson told Ukraine to keep fighting, and the US declared one of its goals was to weaken Russia. Now, Moscow has made it clear that any future peace deal must recognize the territory it has annexed as Russian. The New York Times reported on December 23rd that Russian President Vladimir Putin has been signaling through diplomatic channels that he is open to a ceasefire and that freezes the fighting along the current lines. And there's another interesting little note to this story. If you follow Kit Clarenberg on Twitter, I know he does a lot of his own independent work, and he's also with the Gray Zone. He reported that there was a Russian, I believe, diplomatic plane sitting at the I believe Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. for several days, like 2 or 3 days. And so this would be, you know, uncommon if they're just rotating out diplomatic staff or something like that. And suggests to some extent that what we are looking at here is maybe some talks between U.S. and Russian officials. So, kids reporting with the Politico story I find to be very interesting. Back to Dave's article here. The Politico report said U.S. and European officials are discussing deploying Ukrainian forces in a defensive posture instead of continuing the failed counteroffensive. The shifting strategy comes as both the US and Europe are struggling to come up with more funding for the proxy war. Part of the Biden administration's long-term strategy is to help Ukraine build up its own military-industrial complex so the country is not so reliant on foreign aid. The Biden administration has not publicly outlined this shift in strategy, but there are signs the US thinking about winding down the proxy war. A mantra commonly repeated by US and NATO officials was that they would support Ukraine as long as against Russia for as long as it takes. But when President Biden met with President Zelensky earlier this month, he said the US would continue to support Ukraine for as long as we can. For his part, Zelensky maintains his war aims are to drive Russian forces out of all of Ukrainian territory that has been captured. Time magazine recently spoke with an aide to Zelensky who said the Ukrainian leader deludes himself into thinking Ukraine can win. We're out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that, the aide told Time magazine. So I think that is very important. One more fairly important article on the future of Ukraine here. Ukrainian government workers will face salary and pension delays if US and EU don't approve more aid. This from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. The Ukrainian deputy prime minister said Wednesday that Ukrainian government workers could face delays in the payment system of their salaries or pensions if the US and EU do not approve a new package soon. The deputy prime minister said the support of partners is extremely critical. We need it urgently. The US has been funding the Ukrainian government with tens of billions of dollars through a form of assistance known as direct budgetary aid, which pays for government services and salaries and even subsidizes small Ukrainian businesses. But the aid has all dried up as Congress is yet to approve a new $60 billion package. President Biden is seeking to fund the proxy war in Ukraine and prop up the Zelensky government. The EU has been trying to push out through a $50 billion euro package, 50 billion euro, not dollar package, for Ukraine that would be distributed over 4 years, but it has been vetoed by Hungary. European Union officials are set to meet on February 1st to try to push the funds through again, but it's unclear if Budapest will approve. Republicans in Congress are holding out on approving the new spending for Ukraine war until Democrats agree to significant changes to border policies and immigration laws. Senate negotiators failed to reach a deal before the holiday recess and won't be returning to Washington until after the new year. And I think unlike most Americans, I think most people I know go back to work, go back to school on January 2nd. Congress actually takes off that whole week and goes back to work on January 8th. The Ukrainian deputy prime minister said the new aid is not approved soon. Ukraine's economy will push into what he called survival mode. Kiev may have to delay paying wages for 500,000 civil servants and 1.4 million teachers, and benefits for 10 million pensioners. And so it seems like the Ukrainian government is in a lot of trouble. One last story on the Ukraine situation here. This is Russia says U.S. demands prevent hostage swap. This is a statement from the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Rabkov. He said, "Here, as many in other areas, we observe America's traditional desire to get more for ourselves and give minimum, as they say. The American media in general, at the instigation of the current administration, are actively engaged in savoring these stories. This is a difficult process, even when it is concluded confidentially behind closed doors. It is interesting that participants in these contacts on the American side insist on their complete confidentiality. We also adhere to that line, but then certain turns occur when the White House regularly makes leads and begins to discuss sensitive issue in public spaces. And what Rabkov is talking about is the U.S. demands on a hostage or a prisoner swap. There is a Wall Street Journal reporter that's been locked up in Russia for, I think, about a year now, and then also Paul Whelan, that's been in Russia for several years, well before the war. And I guess there's been talks in the background about this. It seems like part of the Russian complaint is that the Americans are asking for these talks not to be public, and then the Americans end up being the ones that make them public in order to frame the debate against the Russians. Next up here from Dave DeCamp on China. Chinese military says Pentagon spending bill exaggerates China threat. China's defense ministry said Thursday that provisions included in the Pentagon annual military spending bill that President Biden recently signed into law uh, unreasonably exaggerates the so-called China threat. The 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, includes an amendment to expand the U.S. military presence in the Asia Pacific to provide more military support to Taiwan. The Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson Wu Quan told reporters that the NDAA grossly interferes in China's internal affairs and seriously damages China's sovereignty, security, development, and interests. The Chinese military is strongly dissatisfied with and firmly opposed to this. Wu criticized the U.S. alliance building in the Asia Pacific that's been done explicitly to prepare for a future war with China in the region. The NDAA Apologies, just lost my place. The NDAA includes an amendment to sell nuclear power submarines to Australia, which is a part of the AUKUS military pact that the US, Australia, and Britain formed in 2021. Wu had strong words for the US assistance to Taiwan, as it is the most sensitive issue between the US and China. He said the Taiwan issue is purely China's internal affair and does not tolerate the external interference, adding that the U.S. must stop its provocative behavior of using Taiwan to chain China. The U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan in 1979 as part of its normalization deal with China, but has continued to sell weapons to the island. In 2023, the U.S. began financing military aid to Taiwan for the first time, a step that enraged Beijing. In the 2024 NDAA, military aid for Taiwan continues and contains other forms of assistance, including a requirement for the Secretary of Defense to create a comprehensive training program for the Taiwanese military. Wu also commented on reports that the U.S. was reclaiming a World War II airfield in Tian, an island that the U.S. That's a U.S. Pacific territory about 118 miles north of Guam. The airfield was used as a launching point for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Wu said the United States is strengthening its foreign military deployment in the Asia Pacific region and has increased tensions. Countries in the region should remain highly vigilant. The U.S. military needs to clear the jungle that's taken over the airfield since it's been abandoned. According to Stars and Stripes, the NDAA includes tens of millions of dollars in funding for the island, which was one of several World War II era airfields the U.S. is restoring across the Western Pacific. All right, next up here, we are getting into some news on the war in Gaza, and we have quite a bit today. Israel's security agency ignored warnings from Gaza source about October 7th attack. This Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, December 28th. Months before the October 7th attack on southern Israel, the Israeli security agency Shin Bet received a warning from one of its sources in Gaza that Hamas was planning to carry out a big move shortly after Yom Kippur, which took place on September 25th this year, Israel's Channel 12 reported. The report says Shin Bet dismissed the warnings as insignificant and said the intelligence did not make it to senior officials in the agency or its chief, Ronen Bar. Shin Bet sources said the lack of corroborating intelligence, and the fact that the source only recently started talking to the Israeli agency contributed to the tip not being taken more seriously, although they later admitted the source was considered highly reliable. The tip was just one of many pieces of the intelligence that was ignored or not taken seriously at the time by the Israeli security establishment, which led to Israel failing to prevent the October 7th Hamas attack. The New York Times reported in November that Israel had obtained Hamas's battle plans for the attack on October 7th, more than a year before it took place, but Israeli military and intelligence officials did not believe Hamas was capable of carrying it out. The Times report said the document obtained did not set a date for the attack, but described a methodical assault designed to overwhelm the fortifications around the Gaza Strip, take over Israeli cities, and storm a key military base, including a division headquarters, and added that Hamas followed the blueprint with shocking precision. According to Haaretz, Israeli military officials also ignored warnings from women in the Israeli Defense Forces who worked as spotters on the Gaza border. The women spent their days watching surveillance footage and reported unusual Hamas activity for an entire year, but their warnings were not taken seriously. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has come under intense diplomatic pressure due to the intelligence failures and previous strategy of helping prop up Hamas to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. Polls show that a majority of Israelis want him to resign once the war in Gaza is over, giving him incentive to keep the massacre going as long as he can. Next up here is an article that I wrote for the Institute on December 28th. Over 500 Israeli soldiers killed since October 7th. The death toll for Israeli soldiers continues to grow. Nearly 400 members of the Israeli security forces were killed on October 7th. Since the Israeli Defense Forces invaded Gaza, at least over 150 soldiers have been killed. After several revisions, Tel Aviv now says that about 1,050 Israelis were killed on October 7th Hamas attack, including 373 soldiers. And then there were also, as well as the Israelis, I think between 75 and 100 foreigners who were also killed. So that would put the actual toll at about 1,100. Following the Hamas assault, Israel devastated Gaza with a ruthless bombing campaign, then deployed the IDF into the Strip. The ground invasion has led to the deaths of 164 Israeli soldiers, according to the Times of Israel. The Israeli defense minister said 3,000 soldiers have been wounded in combat. Some media outlets have reported the current wounded count far higher, that being 5,000. An expert speaking with the Associated Press estimates the number will be about 20,000 once cases of PTSD are diagnosed. While Israel has caused death and devastation across Gaza, it is unclear how much success Tel Aviv has had in wiping out Hamas. At the end of November, the IDF reported killing about 1,000 or 2,000 Hamas fighters. Over the past month, Tel Aviv has increased its insertion to 7,000 members of Hamas killed. The group reports losing about 10% of its members, or approximately 3,000 fighters. The Israeli operations appear to be having a far greater impact on the civilian population of the besieged enclave. Over 21,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 8,000 children. Additionally, Israel has destroyed the medical, food, water, and sewage infrastructure of Gaza, putting the Palestinian people on the brink of epidemic and famine. Next up here, this is a report from Middle East Eye, and they have another case where they have some pretty strong witness testimony here that the Israeli forces are carrying out executions. A witness to an Israeli attack told Middle East Eye, without regard for women, children, or the elderly who were sleeping, the Israeli forces lobbed 2 grenades into the house. They then opened fire directly at people and in indiscriminate manner, without differentiating between young and old. Whoever is alive, get out of the room now. The soldiers then returned. The soldiers ordered, whoever is still alive, get out of the room now. Then the soldiers returned to the room and executed all the injured. A pregnant woman was left behind to bleed to death by the Israeli forces, and her 4-year-old son was also left behind with significant injuries. I posted many appeals on social media and through journalists and tried to contact the International Committee of the Red Cross to move the wounded child, the wounded 4-year-old, to a hospital in the south, but that all went in vain. All we want now is urgently treatment for the boy. One witness said 9 people were killed in the house. The Palestinian authorities say they have received over 130 reports of executions by Israeli soldiers. Middle East Eye reports in some cases, groups of people are lined up in a pit dug by Israeli forces before being shot and then buried in mass graves. The Palestinian media office said other instances included killing a pregnant woman walking in front of a hospital and waving white flags, as well as men shot and killed in front of their families. The Euromed Monitor said it had documented at least 9 different instances where the groups of civilians were shot and killed without posing a threat to Israeli sources, and Middle East Eye does acknowledge that it can't independently verify these claims, which is not unsurprising given the situation in Gaza. Next up here, Washington Post. Israeli destruction in Gaza more significant than destruction of Aleppo. So, the outlet reports the Washington Post analyzed satellite imagery, airstrike data, and UN damage assessments and interviewed more than 28 workers, healthcare providers, and experts in munitions and aerial warfare. The evidence shows that Israel has carried out its war in Gaza at a pace and level of destruction that exceeds any recent conflict, destroying more buildings in far less time than they were destroyed during Syria's regime's battle for Aleppo from 2013 to 2016, and the U.S. campaign to defeat the Islamic State in Mosul, Iraq, and in Raqqa, Syria in 2017. I thought the Aleppo comparison was very important. If we remember back to 2015-2016 in that presidential election, the battle for Aleppo, which, there you had legitimate Al-Qaeda terrorists being the opposition, propped up by America, just indiscriminately killing civilians all over the place. And over the course of like 3 or 4 years, that, city was decimated by Assad's Air Force, which, just because of the limited Syrian military capabilities, includes a lot of unguided, they were using like barrel bombs and things like that in Aleppo. And so, if the situation in Aleppo was so severe that this was the reason the US had to remain and step up our military operations in Syria and really work against the Syrian regime, sanction the Syrian regime, and do what we could to lead to the end of the Assad government, then what Israel is doing in Gaza is worse in 12 weeks than what Assad did in 4 years, then there's a real problem here. And it would, suggest that the U.S. was even being mildly consistent in our position. We would be backing Hamas and not Israel, because, that's the group that's leveling the death and destruction here. Not that I support backing Hamas at all. I'm just, making the comparison. So back to the Post article here. The Post also found that Israel's military has conducted repeated and widespread airstrikes in proximity to hospitals, which are supposed to receive protection under international law. Satellite imagery reviewed by the Post reporters revealed dozens of apparent craters near 17 of the 28 hospitals in northern Gaza, where the bombing and fighting were most intense during the first 2 months of the war, including 10 craters that suggested the use of bombs weighing 2,000 pounds, the largest in regular use. And so Israel, what the Post is reporting, that Israel was using its largest bombs near hospitals. Surprising there were posters reporting on it. Next up here, Israel requesting Apache attack helicopters from U.S., and I wrote this for the Institute on December 28th. Israeli officials have asked their American counterparts for additional Apache attack helicopters. The White House has not given Tel Aviv a response, leading Israel to step up pressure on the U.S. The Israeli Defense Forces are heavily reliant on Apache helicopters across multiple fronts. Ynet, an Israeli outlet, reported that the Israeli defense minister requested the attack helicopters from the White House, but the White House has not reached a decision. Ynet explains the IDF requested Apache attack helicopters from the U.S., but has been denied so far. The request was made to the Pentagon in recent weeks and was also raised by Defense Minister Gallant during his recent meeting with U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin during his visit to Israel next week. Security sources suggest that the final decision on the potential acquisition has not been made, and Jerusalem is continuing to apply pressure. Since October 7th, Israel has used Apache attack helicopters in Gaza, the West Bank, and along the northern border in battles with Hezbollah. Israel only has 2 squadrons with Apaches, which are currently experiencing heavy use. Ynet reports these squadrons have been conducting round-the-clock operations in Gaza since the beginning of the war. The Israeli air war in Gaza has annihilated much of the besieged enclave. Tel Aviv has conducted the military operations in Gaza with President Joe Biden's full-throated support. The White House has remained steadfast in its pledge to provide Tel Aviv with unconditional military aid. The brutality of Israel's war in Gaza has led many experts to conclude Israel was conducting a genocide in Gaza. In under 3 months, over 21,000 people are dead, including 8,000 children. The number of Palestinian children killed vastly exceeds the number of Hamas members Israel claims to have killed thus far. Palestinians are beginning to face an even larger threat than Israeli bombs or bullets, however. Israel has been stifling aid deliveries into Gaza while devastating the Strip's food, sewage, medical, and water infrastructure. The result of Tel Aviv's policy is 2.3 million Palestinians are now on the brink of famine and epidemic. Next one here from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Netanyahu refuses to discuss post-war plans for Gaza with security chiefs. According to Israeli media reports, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has refused requests from his top military and intelligence officials to discuss potential plans for post-war Gaza. Israel's Channel 12 reports that Netanyahu rebuffed 3 separate requests from heads of Mossad, the Shin Bet, and IDF. An unnamed Israeli security source said, "Time is right now and decisions need to be made already about how to act with regard to all the relevant actors inside and outside of the Gaza Strip. The Americans want explanations." In response to the report, Netanyahu's office said he had instructed his top aides to prepare for preliminary deliberations on the matter. The news of Netanyahu's refusal to discuss the topic comes as Ron Dreamer, Netanyahu's Minister for Strategic Affairs, is in Washington and due to meet with high-level U.S. officials to discuss the Israeli assault on Gaza. The U.S. and Israel have very different visions for a post-war Gaza, as the Biden administration is calling for a revitalization of the Palestinian Authority and for that to take over the Gaza Strip, while Netanyahu has publicly rejected the idea. The Israeli leader has said several times now that he envisions an open-ended military occupation of Gaza. The U.S. and Israel are far apart on Israel's current military operations in Gaza. U.S. officials say they have advised Israel to wrap up the current phase of the war, which involves constant airstrikes and ground operations to take a more targeted approach against Hamas leadership. But Netanyahu and other Israeli officials say military operations are expanding in Gaza and have vowed the onslaught will continue over the long term. So far, the U.S.-backed Israeli massacre has led to over 21,000 deaths, including 8,000 children, including to numbers from the Gazan Health Ministry, which is believed to be a low estimate. Netanyahu has an interest in continuing the onslaught as his political career is in peril due to intelligence failures that led to the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel. Additionally, before this even happened, Netanyahu was under trial for corruption and was possibly facing jail time. So he faces a lot of problems here. All right, next up here, Biden asked Netanyahu to release Palestinian tax revenue collected by Israel. Axios reports President Biden held a difficult conversation last weekend with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over Israel's decision to withhold part of the tax revenue it collects from the Palestinian Authority. Israel collects tax revenue for the PA. Tel Aviv halted transfers of funds to the PA after October 7th. Axios says, according to the officials, Biden asked Netanyahu to accept a proposal that the Israeli Prime Minister himself raised several weeks ago to transfer the withheld tax revenues to Norway for safekeeping until an arrangement can be found that will assure Israel's concerns that the funds could not reach Hamas. However, it appears that Netanyahu has now walked away from that. A U.S. official and a source with knowledge of the call said Netanyahu has backtracked and does not think this is a good idea anymore. He told Biden that he does not trust the Norwegians. And so it seems like a lot of times here, what we have Israel doing is essentially just stringing the Americans along. They propose something and the Americans say, oh, that sounds like a good idea. And then once that plan actually needs to come to fruition and start playing out, the Israelis event some kind of problem with it. All right, next up here, Senator Lindsey Graham calls for U.S. to blow parts of Iran off of the map. Senator Graham has called for the U.S. to bomb Iran in response to Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, saying Iranian bases and oil fields should be blown off the map. The hawkish senator claimed that without Iran, there would be no Houthis, but the Houthis, formerly known as Anzalone, are a homegrown movement of Zaydi Shia Muslims. The Zaydi Shia imams ruled the area of North Yemen that the Houthis now control for 1,000 years until 1962. Without Iran, there is no Houthis, Graham told Fox and Friends on Wednesday. The Houthis are completely backed by Iran. I have been saying for 6 months now, hit Iran. They have oil fields out in the open. They have Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters you can see from space. Blow it off the map. The Houthis have been targeting Israeli-linked commercial shipping in the Red Sea and have made clear they will not stop until Israel ends the siege in Gaza. The U.S. has launched military operations in response, but has not targeted the Houthis directly, which would involve bombing Yemen. Graham criticized the Biden administration for not bombing the Houthis, which would jeopardize a peace deal in Yemen. We are fighting the Houthis. We beat the Germans and the Japanese. We should be able to beat the Houthis. Secretary Austin and the Biden administration are failing our troops in the field. And, getting to this last part here is I think where Lindsey Graham really doesn't understand the situation. If you look at what the U.S. is facing in Yemen, you think the Houthis, the U.S. should be able to wipe these people off the face of the map. I mean, if we want to just conduct a large-scale bombing campaign of Yemen, that would certainly be something that we could do. But, you see from the situation in Gaza just causing large spread destruction, or from the 8-year Saudi war in Yemen, just, widespread destruction of Yemen or of any area whatsoever, doesn't mean that you're going to defeat the military group that controls that region. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the U.S. really has no allies in the region who are willing to help then take on the Houthis. If the U.S. goes to the war with the Houthis now, if the Saudi aided the U.S. going to war with the Houthis, if the UAE or any of these countries in the region went to war aiding the Americans on behalf against the Houthis, it's going to be seen as a war against Muslim people, standing up for the people of Gaza who are experiencing a genocide on behalf of Israel, the country committing a genocide against them. I can't imagine that even in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, where these ruling families have tons and tons of control, that they would be willing to, risk their popularity to fight a war for Israel. That just seems unlikely to me. And so if the U.S. does this in Yemen, we may essentially be going it alone. And again, we can hit a lot of targets in Yemen, but a lot of what the Houthis are launching as ships are just, mobile ballistic missile and drone setups that are very easy to move, very easy to set up, very quick to fire. And I'm sure they have a lot of stores of these underground. After all, the Saudis spent 8 years bombing Yemen, trying to destroy all these factories and missile production sites and storage sites, and just have been completely unable to do so. And so, Washington, not because the Biden administration doesn't want to do more, but I think because logistically their hands are tied, are essentially confined to shooting down $2,000 Houthi drones over the Red Sea with $200,000 anti-ship missiles. And this really just isn't sustainable in the long term. So the idea that, we can't win a fight against the Houthis, but we're going to go to war with Iran is just completely ridiculous. And look, even if the Saudis and the Emiratis and some of these other countries in the Middle East don't love the Ayatollah, the Shias, and the Iranians, I do think that in the current situation, any conflict against Iran that the U.S. launches will be viewed as a war for Israel. And just how tenable is it for these countries to allow the U.S. to use their bases, their airspace, and all the military assets that we have in these countries to attack Iran on behalf of Israel? Seems fairly unlikely to me. And so, the Iranian government, or the Iraqi government, excuse me, is absolutely outraged and livid that the U.S. is, carrying out attacks against Shia militias in Iraq. And so they're not going to allow the U.S. to use their bases to carry out attacks against Shias in Iran or something like that. So, I think Lindsey Graham is just completely off base here and has no idea what he's talking about. The trouble is this is getting very close to the political consensus in Washington. The administration has been somewhat reserved and trying very hard not to escalate the situation in the Middle East. But that is not the case for most politicians in Washington, and most politicians vying for the White House as well. Next up here, we have an article from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, December 27th. Iran atomic chief claims, Iran atomic chief says claims of escalated enrichment untrue, nothing new in nuclear work. So on Wednesday, the head of the IAEA, that's the not the IAEA, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, said that Western media reports of accelerated uranium enrichment were totally unfounded, suggesting the U.S. was hyping up the claims as an attempt to distract from the ongoing war in Gaza. He said, "We are proceeding with our current activity within the framework of regulations." He added that Iran is continuing to enrich uranium to 60%, stating, "We have neither changed our work nor expanded our capacity." The U.S. claimed that the IAEA, which is the International Nuclear Watchdog, said that Iran has tripled their production of near weapons grade uranium in recent weeks, saying that since November they were approaching 9 kilograms per month, whereas in June they only produced 3 kilograms per month. This is typically U.S. hype about Iran's production, centering its allegations on the untruth that 60% enrichment is near weapons grade, when weapons grade is more than 90% purity, something Iran has never even attempted to produce. And so, the U.S. is just stretching the facts and manipulating things as they usually do. All right, Israel warns time for diplomacy with Hezbollah is running out. A member of the Israeli war government says the chance for a diplomatic settlement with Hezbollah is getting low. The fight along the Israel-Lebanon border is intensifying between the IDF and Hezbollah. The Lebanese militant group conducted its heaviest barrage on northern Israel on Wednesday. Senior Israeli Minister Benny Gantz indicated that Tel Aviv is preparing for a war with Hezbollah. He said the situation on Israel's northern border demands change. The stopwatch for a diplomatic solution is running out. If the world and the Lebanese government don't act in order to prevent us from firing on Israel's northern residents, prevent the firing on Israel's northern residents, and to distance Hezbollah from the border, the Israeli military will do it. Fighting along the border broke out after Israel began its historically brutal military operations in Gaza. Hezbollah says its attacks on Israel are to force the IDF to split its army between Gaza in the south and its northern border with Lebanon. On both sides of the war, civilians are being killed. The IDF is alleged to have committed war crimes in Lebanon by using U.S. supply white phosphorus and intentionally targeting and killing a Reuters reporter. Gantz's remarks follow other Israeli official comments explaining that Hezbollah must withdraw several miles from the border or Tel Aviv will escalate its bombing of southern Lebanon. The U.S. is pressuring Hezbollah to accept the Israeli demands. Washington has also threatened to directly intervene if Israel is attacked over its genocidal war against Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip. However, the White House has also applied pressure on Tel Aviv not to escalate the conflict with Hezbollah. The Joe Biden administration has steadfastly opposed using the $3.8 billion in military assistance the U.S. provides to Israel every year to get Tel Aviv to curtail its attacks on Gaza, Syria, or Lebanon. The IDF conducted an airstrike on the home of a Hezbollah fighter on Tuesday night, killing two of his relatives. On Wednesday, Hezbollah responded by two large attacks on cities in northern Israel. The Times of Israel reported rockets fired from Lebanon pummeled the town of Rosh Hankara and the city of Karet Sharoma. The outlet also said there were no other injuries. The Israeli war on Gaza has provoked groups in the Middle East to attempt to apply pressure on Tel Aviv and Washington to end its campaign to ethnically cleanse the Strip. The Houthis have stifled Red Sea shipping. Shia groups in Iraq and Syria have targeted American forces over 100 times, and Hezbollah has traded fire with Israel on a near daily basis since October 7th. All right, a couple of stories here on Iraq. Biden tells Congress he launched airstrikes in Iraq to deter future attacks. So in a letter to Congress, President Biden said he launched Christmas Day airstrikes in Iraq to deter attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, but attacks have continued since. The Pentagon said the airstrikes targeted 3 facilities used by Complete Hezbollah, one of the main Iran-aligned militant groups in Iraq, and came in response to a attack on a U.S. base in Erbil that wounded 3 U.S. troops. The Iraqi government slammed the U.S. for carrying out the airstrikes, saying the bombings killed 1 service member and wounded 18 other people. On the night of December 25th, 2023, at my directions, the United States forces conducted discrete airstrikes against 3 facilities in Iraq used by Iran-affiliated groups for training, logistics, support, and other purposes. The strikes were taken to deter future attacks and were conducted in a manner designed to limit the risk of escalation and minimize civilian casualties, Biden's letter to Congress said. A report said that since U.S. airstrikes were launched, the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, an umbrella group of Shia militant groups, has claimed 5 more attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. An attack on Wednesday again targeted U.S. troops based in Erbil, Iraq. The Biden administration said approximately 2,500 U.S. troops based in Iraq are there under the 2021 AUMF, which was passed in the wake of 9/11. On paper, U.S. troops are stationed in Iraq to assist the Iraqi government in the fight against ISIS, a group that did not exist when the 2001 AUMF became law. The Biden administration also claimed that he could use bombs in Iraq using authorities granted to him by the Constitution. Biden said, "I directed this military action consistent with my responsibility to protect the United States civilians, both at home and citizens, both at home and abroad, in furtherance with U.S. national security and foreign policy interests, pursuant to my constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief and Chief Executive to conduct United States foreign relations." So U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have come under attack over 100 times since mid-October, and those attacks are over U.S. support for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. All right, last article here today. Iraqi Prime Minister says Baghdad is heading towards ending the U.S. military presence in the country. So, the Iraqi Prime Minister said his government is heading towards ending the presence of international forces in Iraq, which include about 2,500 U.S. troops, the largest foreign contingent. The comment came after his government strongly condemned the U.S. government and several rounds of air strikes it conducted in Iraq as violations of Iraqi sovereignty and a hostile act. In the latest strikes, the U.S. said it targeted the Shia militia group Kataib Hezbollah in retaliation for the attack on a U.S. base, but the Iraqi government said civilians were also wounded in the U.S. bombing. We are in the process of rearranging the relationship with international coalition as in light of the presence and capability of Iraqi forces. The Iraqi government is moving towards ending the presence of international coalition forces, the president said in a press conference with the Spanish prime minister. So let's hope this happens. I'm not very optimistic that the Iraqi government really has the political capital to pressure the U.S. We saw them try under the Trump administration and it didn't work out, but we can always hope for the best and, really hope that one day the U.S. military occupation and really the war in Iraq that has almost lasted like over 3 decades now will finally and officially come to an end, and the people of the middle part of North America could finally leave the people in the Persian Gulf alone. All right, that'll be the end of the show today, the last show of 2023. Thank you all so much for your support, not just donating to the Libertarian Institute fundraiser, but everybody who has shared the show, who has promoted the show in some way, or even retweeted or shared some of the articles that myself, our co-host Connor Freeman write. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this as my job and talk about these really important events and write about them on a near daily basis. And it's all possible thanks to the audience. So I really appreciate all of you guys, and I look forward to talking to you next year.